Yes, so John's Gospel, there are a couple of readings. So we start off at the beginning, John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. The Word became flesh. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He comes after me, ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God. It is the only Son, himself God, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." And then moving on to chapter 8 of John, verses 1 to 11. Meanwhile, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They said this to him to test him, so that they might have something to bring a charge against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again."
Great. Thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you so much for your very kind words. And it's really a real pleasure to be here with you. It's a really lovely thing to be invited. And as we said, we're going to focus in on grace and truth. And I'm going to ask Chris to stand up in a second. I'm going to ask him a few questions about some of his journey. We're going to do that in like 3 sections. And some of the things we're talking about are quite extreme, about when people end up sleeping rough, about some of the issues that happen. And this might be a world a long way from a lot of you, a lot of your experiences. But I really hope that it's helpful for everyone in whatever circumstance they're in. Maybe, there are people you're trying to support, or people in difficulties that you're supporting. And I think this grace and truth, tension and dynamic that we'll explore is really relevant in so many ways. So when Charlie invited me, and I was thinking and I looked at the map, and I've known Chris for, I think, about 13 or 14 years now, and he lives in Gravesend, so that's not too far. I did have a few challenges with the M25 on the way here, but I thought it would be great to actually bring him along too. So, Chris, do you want to come up and come up to the mic here? That's great. And so, Chris, we met, didn't we, in 2011 at the Greenbelt Festival, and you were there. You'd come along with a church, hadn't you?
Yeah.
And we met, we'll say a little bit more about this. I was running a seminar about homelessness, and Chris actually stood up and shared some of his journey and his story there. But do you want to just take us back to how things were sort of 5 or 6 years before we first met? What was your situation?
I was I'd been living on the streets for about 4 years, which is... It's not a very nice place to live. When you see someone sleeping on the street and you see them in a doorway, there's a lot of stuff that's deeper going on with their lives and in the lives that they're living, and even as an addict, living on the street is a very, very scary time in my life. It was an eye-opener to what was going on. Because like many, I just thought that the person sleeping in a doorway, that was it. But there's a lot more to it, a lot of dangerous world.
And how had you got into that state? What had been your journey? You'd been in the army. You'd grown up in South East London, gone into the army. And when you'd left, what happened? What led to you ending up being on the streets?
I think, like as John said, I come from South London. It was quite a rough neighbourhood that I was in. I was getting in trouble as a kid. And I see this going into the army as a way of running away from the trouble. But really I was running away from something else that we'll talk about a bit later. But and when I came out of the army, I got involved with drugs and drink. Not too heavy, but just tasting it here and there. To me, my life was perfect. I was in a good relationship with a beautiful lady, and we settled down, we had children. I had a really good job in social work. I worked with people with learning disabilities. To me, my life was just completely normal, but for others around me, they actually see how much the addict was affecting my life. There was like two people living within me. There was me, that I thought was normal, and then there was the addict that the other people were seeing. And it was the addict that other people wasn't liking. Slowly they moved away from the addict and me.
What was your behaviour like? What was going on?
I mean, my behaviour was, when I look back on it, it was disgusting. It was terrible. It was abusive. It just sometimes like...
And what did it lead to? Like, what then happened? I mean, did people get fed up with that?
Yeah, I mean, people didn't want to be around me, And to me, it was their fault. It was never my fault. It was always like a poor me syndrome. Oh, everybody's leaving me, because they're... I won't say the word, but, it's their fault. It was never my fault.
You're doing well on the language.
I know,
well
sorry.
It's great.
John did...
We had a briefing on the way.
Yeah. I did get my wrist slapped a few times on the way down here. I was like, John, I'm trying to get the swear words out now.
Really?
Slowly people didn't want to know me, and it got to the point where my wife, she chucked me out of the house, said enough's enough. And I really hated her at that time and really blamed her that it was her fault that I was an addict and or become this addict and this horrible, nasty person. And when I look back now, and I've looked back, it's like many years now, I've been clean for about 17, 18 years. I admire what she done. I really do, because I was just dragging her down, and I was dragging my children down. And it's really hard for me to say that I would have destroyed the relationship and I would have destroyed my children. And I admire her to this day that she had the courage to say, enough's enough, get out.
And part of your journey is that you can say that and you can sort of almost, appreciate what she did. But what then happened? What was the sort of, you said about 3 or 4 years on the streets and things got really low. Charlie gave a bit of a warning earlier that things got really grim, didn't they, for you?
Yeah, I think when I was on the streets, I was going through this, like, blaming everybody and not taking any responsibility for myself. It's very easy for me to stand up here today because I'm clean and sober and say these things. If I was still my addict, it'd still be everybody else's fault, I think. But,
And you ended up thinking life wasn't worth going on.
Talk a bit about suicide. So I know Charlie said that if anyone wanted to leave the room, now's the time.
Yeah.
Brave people.
Yeah, I mean, just say briefly, what happened and what it led to.
Like I said before, I had this vision in my head that I'd been on the streets for 4 years and I'd had enough. I just wanted to end it all, but I wanted to kill the addict. And in my head, where I was just full of drugs and alcohol, that if I killed the addict, then I would be back. But there was no me anymore. I'd disappeared. And there was just this addict. So I was killing me as well. And I had this crazy idea that it was a Boxing Day. I was really drunk. I'd been causing lots of trouble in town. And I walked past the petrol station and just thought, I'll end it here. So I walked in, got the pump, poured petrol over me, and lucky enough, as I went to light my lighter, because it was soaked in petrol, it wouldn't flick or nothing. And then within seconds, it seemed like a lifetime, but it was seconds. There was loads of police there. They jumped on me, and I ended up being sectioned for 3 months in a mental institution because I was a danger to myself and society. So I spent 3 months in a mental institution, and then they wasn't going to let me out then because I would have been street homeless again. Yeah. So that journey in the mental institute carried on for a little bit longer.
I'm going to pause you there, Chris.
Yeah.
And basically, I'm just going to show a little model that I think I've used a lot with people affected by homelessness, sort of sums up an issue. Actually, you take a seat, Chris, and I'll pull you up in a minute, because that's the real grim part, that's the real low point. And whenever we look at people who end up homeless, I think it's really helpful to think about the different things that can lead them to become homeless. Like, firstly here, the lack of resources, that actually in so many, Chris is one story, but for so many people at the moment, homelessness is a matter of resources, of not having affordable housing. I'm sure affordability of housing is something that you'd all recognise as a massive issue. Issues of debt really building up for people. They're really significant. But it's not just this, it's this issue of relationships as well. When I was running that hostel in Soho, the most obvious cause of homelessness with the young people I was working with was that their relationships had broken down, that they'd been kicked out of their homes, or things had broken down for whatever reason. And of course, these two things combine, because often, if you've got low resources, if you're from a tough background, then your relationship's going to be under more pressure. And equally, if your relationship's under pressure, it can affect your resources and what you've got available. And just lastly, and most deeply, and I think a lot of what Chris talked about, is this sort of poverty of identity that affects people. That it's not just their relationships with other people, but it's their relationship with themselves that's so problematic and difficult. And at the moment, issues around self-esteem, around mental health, and addictions that are so closely wrapped up with that are so prevalent. And I think when we think about rough sleeping and homelessness, it's really important to think about how all of these factors work together. They're interplaying with each other. And of course, an addiction, like Chris talked about, affects all three of these. It takes your resources. In Chris's example, it didn't just take his, it took his family's, took his children's resources. The addiction was that powerful. It can, ruin your relationships, like Chris was saying. And of course, it starts to corrode your very identity. And especially what Chris was saying about the addict within him. All of these issues that are inside people. Sometimes people think homelessness is very much just about houselessness. So they think the solution is just a flat. And of course, that's important. That gives the resource that someone might need. But in some ways, that's the easy part. The really complicated bit of working with people affected by these issues is establishing better relationships. And it's restoring a positive sense of identity. So there is a real sort of rock bottom there that we left Chris's story. Things do get better, which is why he's here. And I think this verse, I know it was a slightly different version of the Bible that I've put up here than the one read, but I think this passage, which is so famous at the beginning of John's Gospel, all about the incarnation. John's opening chapter is so cosmic in its whole significance that the God who created all things incarnated himself. The Logos, the Word, became flesh, made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And as I said earlier, I've been working the last 30 years as a Christian in this work. And Charlie said about being a Christian in the public sphere. And that has very much been the role I've done, because I've been working for charities that are quite high profile. And I've been thinking about how the theology connects to the work in practice. And I think this verse has been the most important one for me. That, as we said, Jesus has grace right at the heart of his message. As you read John's Gospel, the healings of people on the margins, the people struggling, the people who other people forget, the respect he gives them, the parables he tells, the stories about lost sons who go away and lose everything and blow it all, but are received back with grace. The miracles, the water into wine, and the forgiveness that he offers. All of these things, this grace is right at the heart of our message. And it's not just a grace that's theoretical, a grace that is just to do with us and God in some kind of transaction to forgive us from sin, but a grace that we should embody, that our place should be full of. I love the words that you've got around love generously, act justly, forgive swiftly. These are all words of grace, aren't they? The power of grace to restore people. And this is what's driven, time and time again, Christians to set up homeless charities. Virtually all of the big homeless charities in the country have been set up by Christians or church leaders. Organisations like Shelter, set up in the 60s. Centrepoint, as I said, started by an Anglican vicar. You go back further, the Salvation Army, Church Army, Cyrenians. Time and time again, it's been Christians setting up these organisations to embody grace and to show grace. But I want to say that grace by itself often isn't enough. This is why I think it's so important that Jesus came from the Father full of grace and truth. And you can't turn Jesus' ministry into just a sort of an acceptance of everything and everyone. You know, he says, I've come not to bring peace, but to bring a sword. You know, he's got a sharp edge of challenge in his ministry. You know, 28 times in John's gospel, he says the phrase, I tell you the truth. You know, people find it a hard teaching, a teaching that challenges. He's got especially challenging words around status and around wealth. This is the kind of edge that Jesus brings. Someone described Jesus' ministry as comforting the disturbed, but also disturbing the comfortable. And we can't get away from that when we read the gospel messages. And what does this mean in practice about how we live? And especially the kind of issues that we're talking about with Chris. Chris, can you come back up for part 2? Hope you're all right jumping up. That's great. I want you to take us back. You've been in that mental institution. You got resettled. You got into a flat, didn't you? But you know, in a lot of ways, your lifestyle was still similar, even though you weren't homeless anymore. You were in a flat. But how were you living?
Yeah, I was just an alcoholic, drug addict with a roof over my head now, rather than sleeping in a doorway.
So you had the resource of a flat, but your relationships and identity were pretty similar, were they?
Yeah, but even with the resources, I was given a flat, and all I had was a blanket. It was the middle of winter. I had a blanket and some candles that I'd nicked from a shop. Yeah. And then I didn't have the understanding on how to get electricity because I'd been on the streets for so long, and because of the drugs and the alcohol, I'd forgotten how to live a proper life. So I didn't know that I had to put gas on my meter or electricity on my meter. I didn't know anything like that.
I'm going to fast forward a bit because the doorbell goes, and who knocked on your door?
So there's a guy from the church army. Funny enough, his name was John.
It's not me.
It's not him.
It's another John.
It's not this one.
No, right.
I've been plagued by Johns.
Thank you. Delightful.
Yeah, bringing me light. Yeah.
Okay, so where was he from? He was church army, and he was connected with a local church. Yeah, very good, very good. We work on our banter quite a lot. Great. I'm going to have, because we're slightly got to rush along.
John knocks at the door, and I go down, and I was very scared of opening the door because I didn't know if it was drug dealers wanting money and blah blah this and blah blah that. And there's a guy standing in a suit, and I thought he was a bailiff, but then I didn't have nothing to nick or to take back, so it didn't bother me then. And he said, "Hello, I'm John from the church." And straight away, my eyes lit up, and it's like the God Squad's here to save me, and here they come. So he came in, and he looked around, and he said, "Are you living like this?" And I went, "What do you mean, am I living like this?" He said, "Is this how you live, on the floor?" And I went, "Yeah." "Don't worry, I'll get you this and get you that." And off he goes, and he comes back. He's got me all this stuff, and he brings loads of food. And I think that's really good because I haven't got a cooker to cook it on, but never mind, thank you. And I wasn't really grateful for him being there, and he kept coming back, and that was the thing. Every day he'd come back. And then came the question about going to the church, and I made all excuses. I know I can't come today, I can't come today. And in the end, I thought, yeah, I'll give it a go. So I went to the local church, and I see it as a place. There was all these people wanting to give me stuff, like clean clothes and cakes and little old ladies.
They were big on cakes, weren't they?
Yeah, little old ladies coming up and making me cakes and offering me cups of tea. And it's really hard to say now, especially within a church, that I just see it as a place where I could abuse. And that's quite hard saying that in front of people, you know, like that, yeah, I went there willing to abuse kind people. But then you think about it, that's all I'd done throughout my time on the street. Yeah.
So you were trouble.
Yeah, I was horrible, again, because I was using again and drinking, giving me the roof. It was easy for me to drink in the winter rather than getting cold because I had a warmer environment. But
and what happened then? What was the point at which, why are you sort of standing here being able to reflect on it? What happened?
There was a little old lady, Doris, and she used to do the teas. And everyone was so kind to me, but she kind of built up a relationship with me. If, I went to the counter and took too many biscuits, she'd say, put some of them back, there's other people here. And that. She was straight with me and that. Yep. And then one day I went in and I was really smelly and been drinking. And I went to get a cup of tea and she went to me, I'm not giving you a cup of tea. She said, you smell. She said, you're disgusting. Your behaviour's disgusting. She said, get out of our church. And I was shocked that this little old lady had the front to actually tell me the truth. And I was shocked in one way, but I was so glad because for years I'd wanted someone to tell me the truth about what I really was, rather than saying it was the drugs and the drink that was making me like this. Yeah, it was, but this is what I turned into. And I looked at her and I went, I want a cup of tea. I was like the spoilt little child. And she said, no, get out. She said, I've had enough of you. She said, you're disgusting, you stink, you're horrible, you're a horrible person. And she kind of chucked me out of church. And I was in shock. And I went back and I was cursing her as I walked back to my flat and got in and cracked open a beer and sat there drinking a beer, cursing her. And then something said to me, but she's right. What she said is the truth. And something hit me then that I'd go back and show her a lesson. And the following Sunday, I didn't drink before I went to church. And I made sure I had a wash. And I went in the church for the first time sober. And I looked presentable. I still had shabby clothes on and that. And she just stood there and smiled. And I'll never forget that smile. It meant so much to me. She didn't offer me no cakes. She didn't offer me anything. She just offered her smile. As if to say, you started the journey. And I did. And that's when I thought if I can do it for 1 hour, or 2 hours a day, and I can do it for free, and then I can do it for 4. And then I'd go back and forget about Doris. But then I'd see her. She'd go,
yeah. And Chris, you're saying, is it 17 years now? You've been sober.
Yeah.
So, and actually, we're going to pause there again. But actually, you really count your recovery journey really as starting from that conversation with Doris.
Definitely.
Yeah. Let's give a clap to the 17 years. Great. Okay, I'll get you back up. It's great. This is the best illustration of what I was going to say. This is why I was so keen for Chris to come. Because, that truthfulness, I don't want everyone to go home from today thinking they've got to do a Doris with everyone they see. Because as Chris said, that isn't the take-home message. But there was a relationship there. And I just want to show you a little model that, those of you who remember graphs, you got there, we got grace on that side and truth along the bottom here. I can never remember which is the Y or the X-axis. But basically, if you think of grace and kindness and all that stuff I was talking about on one side, and then truthfulness, the honesty and the challenge. And I think if as a Christian or if as a church you're low in grace and truth, you're probably not helping people much. You're probably not a great witness, to be honest. But often there's a problem, I think, in church work. And in some of the Christian work, and some of the culture that we live in, where it's all about grace and kindness and support. And the truthfulness gets lost. And I think this is often quite naive, especially naive in terms of if you really want to help people. But it also leads to a whole load of issues in churches where people aren't really saying what they mean. They're not really brave enough to challenge because they think it's not Christian. And I think a lot of Christian cultures can find it really, really hard to tell the truth. They might be preaching truth or theological truth or debating it, but actually talking about what's really happening in people's lives, in people's behavior, can be really hard. And virtually all the challenges I've seen with the kind of projects I've worked with, especially helping churches develop these kind of ministries, is actually about avoiding this issue of naivety. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, if it's just all truth, if you're just putting that up straight away, then that can be just too harsh, and that's equally ineffective and unloving. It's not just about just telling people where they're wrong in some harsh way. I think this is where some local authorities really get into with some of the messages they say about homelessness. And I've worked a lot of time in Westminster, and things have really often fallen into this trap in terms of the public messaging around homelessness. But I really, really believe in this blend, and I think this is the blend that Chris is talking about that Doris got right. That actually there is the grace of a relationship. Yeah, you can have a biscuit. Don't take 5, though. It's a relationship that does care, but is willing to name truth and talk about things honestly. And I'm not going to go on too long, but just to give you a little model here that I've used a lot in my work, that, there's a column of words there, all to do with grace, of unconditional acceptance, giving people another chance, showing compassion, being flexible, saying yes to people. These are all great things. These are some of the reasons why Christians have stepped out of their comfort zone to help people in need. But that column isn't enough by itself. These words are also really, really important to help people change. As well as acceptance, the enforcement of rules, as well as giving people another chance, the maintenance of boundaries. As well as supporting people, challenging them. Often we need to love people by saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And I think anyone in the room who's a parent can probably see some echoes of this in the ways we have to parent. I'm seeing quite a lot of nods. And it's certainly been true in my case. I'm in a situation, I've got 3 children. My youngest is really struggling at the moment in all kinds of ways. This is very relevant on the home front as well. And I think we have to really get over a view that being Christian is about being on the left-hand side. Actually, I think Jesus models all of these things. And I think in following him, we need to learn more how to blend these things in a loving way. I think in the second reading in John, it's beautifully condensed in this one line or these 2 lines that Jesus says. Obviously, there's this woman being accused of adultery. People are trying to test Jesus. Should we stone her? Should we kill her for what she's done? And when they all walk away after Jesus has challenged them, Jesus says these words. He speaks with grace. Then neither do I condemn you. Jesus doesn't condemn her, and we shouldn't be in the business of condemning anyone. But he doesn't just finish there. He says, but go, leave your life of sin. Go and live differently. Change your ways. And that's the truth. That's the truth element. And I think in that one verse, you've got a condensed example of grace and truth. And I think that in my life, grace and truth has been relevant in all kinds of ways. It's been very relevant in my work. But I've spent quite a lot of time sitting in on 12-step groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, and all of the anonymous groups that you get. And if anyone's had any experience of those groups, I think they're phenomenal examples of grace and truth. Because I used to be at work in the West End of London. There were literally street homeless people sitting next to film stars. So it's a place of grace, a place of open acceptance. But they are so profoundly truthful in what they share. And that's why they're effective, because grace and truth. My wife's a counsellor. You know, in counselling, there's often this theory of having unconditional positive regard for the client. So it's like grace, that there's an unconditional regard for the person having counselling. But from that position, you explore what's true. And I won't go on with all the examples, but this has been so true in my family relationships as well. I had a cousin who was a heroin addict for 20 years. And I had a good relationship with him. I was one of the only people in my family who maintained a relationship with him. But it wasn't because I was kinder or nicer. It was because I had better boundaries, actually. And that I said I was committed to talking and being in a relationship with him, but I wasn't ever going to lend him any money. And the people that did ended up getting really fed up, and their relationships got broken. So I do believe outside of homelessness, which is an extreme example, outside the extremities of Chris's story, I think grace and truth are things to think about continually in our lives, in our relationships, in our church. So I'm just going to ask Chris to stand up once more. We okay time-wise? Great. Chris, me and Chris have done quite a lot of stuff together. This is a few pictures of us. This is us out, so we can name drop here a little bit, can't we? We were at Lambeth Palace. Yeah, exactly. I know it's not a big deal for Baptists, but, you know. And we've been to St Paul's Cathedral. We've been at Lee Abbey down in Devon, where there's a picture of Chris there. And Chris, do you want to say a little bit about your journey since? I was especially thinking about, you know, your journey, especially some of the therapy you've had. Do you want to talk about the sort of grace and truth that you've had to explore there?
Yeah, when I was in this flat, and I was still an addict, and I still wanted to kill myself, basically. I could never understand that. And after a few years, I got into therapy that looks at trauma throughout people's lives. And it was a 4-year program that I was in, and it was really intense. In fact, it was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. It was more harder than living on the streets, because it gave me the courage to go back to everything that I was avoiding that had helped me become an addict and the way that I'd lived my life. All stemmed from childhood trauma that I didn't never want to face and I didn't want to believe in. And this therapy gave me the strength to go back to that traumatized time and understand the emotions and the feelings that have been so mucked up throughout the years that was due to my childhood. So it didn't matter what I'd done in life, because what had happened to me as a child, it was going to happen anyway, kind of thing. I had to take responsibility for my actions, but the root cause wasn't the addiction, wasn't the drugs. They was just a symptom. A symptom of what happened to me during childhood. And since then, finding that out, it's like been a journey of discovery about who I am. And that journey will continue till the day I die. And in it, I will always talk about my addiction, because my addiction now, whereas it was the thing that I wanted to kill, it's something that I embrace because it brought me here today. You know, a much better person. The addict is kind of learning from me now. Yeah. Like the little child that was scared is learning from the adult, and the little child is teaching the adult about everything that they went through. So I'm facing it from all directions, and it's a continuous journey.
And you've gone and helped, haven't you? You're sort of helping the NHS and quite a lot of research into helping homeless people, and you're also, so there's that whole side of stuff, and also you've been volunteering, haven't you? Been working in a day centre in Gravesend for the last sort of 5 years?
Yeah, since I got very ill, I'll do this quickly, but I got very ill through the drugs and the addiction, and they give me 3 days to live. I was in hospital, I weighed 6 stone, and the thing that I wanted in life, I'd finally got. I was going to die, and God didn't let me die. For some reason, there was something else for me to do.
You heard a voice, didn't you?
Yeah, when I came out of the hospital, I couldn't read, write, talk. I couldn't walk, I couldn't do anything. And so I had to learn to read and write and put myself through like a lot of pain of learning how to walk. And yeah, it was a long journey. And then once I got through that, I decided that there was something I needed to be doing in helping others understand what I'd gone through. And the only way I could do that was go and help addicts understand what they're going through. So I've been working with addicts, people with mental health, people rough sleeping now, past years.
Yeah. I'll just say for you, right, I went on your 60th birthday, I went to hear Chris give a talk to a men's group of people going through similar stuff. And honestly, it's one of the best things I've ever sat through, because you shared your story. And of course, they can hear it in such a different way than someone like me talking about anything. And it was such a beautiful, redemption. So I know we've talked about really painful things, and I really hope people who are affected are okay with some of the pain of what Chris has shared. But there's this hope, because even the crappiest, horriblest, difficultest things can be redeemed, like you say, when they're faced up to and owned.
Yeah. It's a hard place to be in. But I think, that inner strength, that inner voice of God, and to me, that's where my God is within me. And when I'm doing something good, then I feel good within myself. And, I don't want no reward or nothing, because it's knowing that I've learnt so much from the journey that he's allowed me to go on.
Yeah, brilliant.
Even though it was a crap time, the crap time has turned something horrible into something positive now.
Yeah.
And that's been a good reward.
Brilliant. Well, it's been a massive blessing to me, and, just thanks so much for everything you shared. I'm going to finish up now. So I'm just going to finish there, just very, very briefly. The charity I work for, as I said, Hope into Action, going back to these 3 circles, we provide a new resource of a house, but new relationships with the church, and also the offer of a new identity. 6 of our tenants last year got baptised, which is just a sort of real apex of taking on a new identity. And it's a beautiful thing when these things come together. And I'm really proud of the witness that the church is. And if there is a take-home that I want to leave you with, that I think it's this equation. That I really believe, we know that God so loved the world that he sent Jesus. And Jesus is all about love. But that love is a tough form of love at times. It's a durable form of love. It's a redemptive form of love that can scoop right to the bottom of the sludge and the crappiness of our humanity and redeem us and pull us up. And I think this is the beautiful thing when we think about grace and truth. That it's a grace that is truthful enough to transform lives. And a truth that is graceful enough to draw us, not to judge us, but to draw us close to God, to be transformed by his love. So thanks very much for inviting me, and great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. Chris, it's just such a privilege, your willingness to share your story with us, so thank you. A real blessing, so thank you for being honest with us. A group of strangers that you've never met, but telling us your story is fab. We are going to come now to communion. And I'd like communion to be a response to what we've heard. So you've heard a lot. There's lots to think about. While we share the bread and while we share the wine, why not use it as an opportunity to mull over what you've heard and to pray and to think?